7 years after Nipsey Hussle's death, his estate is finally closed, but the paperwork reveals something the headlines don't fully explain. The court ordered Nipsey's 2 children to receive 50% of each asset in his estate, not just cash. And when the documents get to the exact list of what they received, the public record suddenly goes black. Cash assets, redacted. Non-cash assets, redacted. So the court confirms exactly how Nipsey's estate was divided, while keeping some of the most interesting details hidden from the public. And after going through the actual court records, there's much more here than simply saying his children split an inheritance. The newest filing gives us the ending first. On July 2nd, 2026, Los Angeles Superior Court Judge Brenda Penny officially discharged Nipsey's brother Samiel Asghedom as the personal representative of the estate. That is important because before an estate reaches this point, the administrator is essentially telling the court that the work required under the final distribution order has been completed. And that is exactly what this filing says. The document states that all property required to be distributed or transferred under the final order had been handled. It says the personal property, including money and other property, had been delivered or transferred to the people entitled to receive it. The receipts were on file. There was no personal property left on hand for distribution, and there was no real property left on hand for distribution either. So by July of 2026, according to the court record, Nipsey's probate estate had reached the end of the road. But the most important document explaining where the property went was actually signed more than 2 years earlier. On April 19th, 2024, the court approved the first and final report from Nipsey's estate administrator. That order contains the structure of the final distribution. And this is where the story gets interesting. The court did not simply say, divide the money 50-50. It authorized a distribution of 50% of each asset to Amani's side and 50% of each asset to Cross's side. For Amani, the property was distributed through the guardians of her estate. For Cross, the property was distributed through his mother and guardian, Lauren London. And directly underneath that 50% language, the court separates the property into 2 categories. Cash assets on hand and non-cash assets on hand. That distinction matters because when people hear about a celebrity estate, it is easy to imagine one giant bank account being divided between the heirs. That is not what these documents show. The court record shows an estate containing different types of property. Some of it was cash, some of it was not, and each child's side was entitled to an equal share. There was also an equalizing payment ordered for Cross's guardianship before the remaining property was divided. But once again, the dollar amount of that payment has been blacked out of the public court copy. And that brings us to one of the most visually striking parts of this entire case. The court order literally reaches the heading, Cash assets on hand as of August 31st, 2023. And then the entire section underneath it is redacted. Then you get to the non-cash property. The document says, non-cash assets on hand as of April 1st, 2019. And once again, the actual list is covered by a large black redaction. So the court confirms that these assets existed. The court confirms how they were supposed to be divided. But the public version does not tell us exactly what every one of those assets was. That is an important line to draw. There has been a lot of discussion over the years about Nipsey's businesses, trademarks, music, ownership interest, and other property. But these particular public court documents do not give us permission to say that his children now directly own a specific percentage of any particular company or trademark. The detailed schedules are redacted. What we can prove is that there were cash and non-cash assets in the estate and that the court ordered them divided 50-50. And the order goes one step further. It says that if any other property belonging to Nipsey or the estate was later discovered, that property was also supposed to be divided equally between the 2 sides. So the 50-50 structure was not limited only to whatever happened to be listed in front of the court that day. Even later discovered estate property was covered. Now here is where the newer paperwork becomes important. We also have the actual receipts showing that both sides eventually acknowledged receiving their shares. Lauren London signed a receipt as guardian of Cross's estate. That receipt says she acknowledged receiving an equalizing payment and 50% of each of the assets listed below. And once again, the documents separate those assets into cash and non-cash property. but the exact dollar amount and the asset descriptions are blacked out. Lauren signed that document in November of 2025. It was later filed with the court in March of 2026. Imani's side filed a separate receipt. Her guardians also acknowledged receiving 50% of each of the assets. Cash assets, redacted. Non-cash assets, redacted. So by the time Samiel asked the court for his final discharge, the paperwork showing that both sides had received their shares was already sitting in the court file. But something else in these documents shows that this distribution process did not simply happen overnight. There were acknowledgments of payments made for the children's benefit going back to 2024. Lauren London signed an earlier document acknowledging payments made for the benefit of Cross's guardianship. The amount is redacted. Imani's guardians filed a similar acknowledgement for payments made for her benefit. That amount is redacted too, so the record shows a process that unfolded over time. Payments were being acknowledged. Then the final distribution order established the 50-50 structure. Later receipts documented the distribution of the remaining cash and non-cash assets. And eventually the administrator returned to court asking to be discharged. But before the court could close everything out, there was another major requirement. The debts had to be handled. And the April 2024 order makes a direct finding on that point. The court says all debts of Nipsey and the estate had been paid. The later service list also identifies several creditor claims as satisfied, released, or withdrawn. Paramount Recording Group is listed with the claim that had been satisfied and withdrawn. American Express is listed as a creditor whose claim had been satisfied and released. The California Franchise Tax Board is listed with a claim that had been satisfied and withdrawn. Several other individual and entertainment-related claims are also identified as satisfied or released. None of that automatically means there was anything unusual or improper happening. Creditor claims are part of the probate process, but they help explain why closing an estate can take years. Assets have to be identified, claims have to be handled, fees have to be paid, beneficiaries have to receive their property, receipts have to be filed, and only then can the administrator ask the court to release him from the job. The legal fees also give us one of the clearest dollar figures in the final paperwork. One law firm acknowledged receiving $78,478.20 in statutory compensation, plus $1,095 in costs. That same firm also acknowledged another $71,432 in extraordinary compensation. A second law firm acknowledged receiving $51,023.78 in statutory compensation, plus $560 in costs. And that firm received another $48,731 in extraordinary compensation. Across those two receipts, that is a little more than $251,000 in attorney compensation and listed costs. But there is a detail immediately connected to that which may say even more about how this estate was handled. The court order states that Nipsey's brother Samiel waived his own right to statutory and extraordinary compensation for administering the estate. In other words, the court authorized legal fees for the attorneys, but Samiel did not take the administrative compensation he otherwise could have requested under the probate process. And remember, this was not a short assignment. Nipsey died in March of 2019. The final distribution order was entered in April of 2024. Lauren's later final receipt was signed in November of 2025. The receipts were filed in March of 2026, and Samiel was not formally discharged until July of 2026, 7 years after Nipsey's death. That timeline is one of the reasons the final order matters. It represents the point where the court was satisfied that the required property had been distributed and the administrator's work was complete. And after reading all of this paperwork, the biggest takeaway is not simply that Nipsey left money behind, it is how the estate was structured at the end. His two children were supposed to share equally, not just in cash. The court specifically identified cash assets and non-cash assets. Both sides later acknowledged receiving 50% of the assets. Any estate property discovered later was also supposed to be divided equally. The debts were reported paid. The creditor claims identified in the later paperwork were resolved. The attorneys were paid. Samiel waived his own administrator compensation, and eventually there was nothing left in the probate estate waiting to be distributed. The one thing the public still cannot see is exactly what was sitting underneath those black boxes. The court acknowledges the existence of those assets. The receipts acknowledge that they were distributed, but the detailed public schedules have been redacted, and maybe that is the most fitting part of this story. Nipsey spent years talking publicly about ownership, building businesses, creating assets, and leaving something behind. Years after his death, the final probate record shows that what remained was not treated as nothing more than cash. There were other assets involved. Those assets were divided equally for his children. And after 7 years of court proceedings, the estate was finally brought to a close. And if you think Nipsey's estate paperwork is interesting, the young Dolph estate records went in a completely different direction. In that case, the court paperwork raised a major question involving millions of dollars in the estate accounting. That breakdown is the next video you need to watch.